Thank you all. I'm Robin Reynolds. I work for Barclays. It's an absolute honour and privilege to talk to you all today. Thank you for including me in this session. I know this is the last of 3 days. So thank you for listening. We're going to have a quiz to start. If you were here for one of the early sessions, I think on Tuesday, Paul Jennings talked about what would Toby's walk-on music be? Well, let's just flip that round. What would Paul Jennings' walk-on music be? That's a good question. So with your left hand, if you think it is Paranoid by Black Sabbath, raise your left hand. If you think it is Ace of Spades by Motorhead, raise your right hand. And if you think it is Walk the Line by Johnny Cash, please stand up. I think there are more right hands, so you think it's Ace of Spades. I think it's actually Paranoid by Black Sabbath, bearing in mind he's a Birmingham lad and loves the whole Ozzy Osbourne thing. So, Paul, if you're there, please confirm. Get in, come on, 1-0 to us, well done team. Hello, if you are live streaming, I'm sorry you couldn't participate in that, but if you want to Google the next question, we won't do you down, but in the room you can't Google the next question. So, 2 weeks after Elvis passed away, something happened. It was the launch of Voyager 2, followed by swiftly by Voyager 1. So the first question is, how far away from the Earth is Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 at the moment? Still going. If you look up a website called NASA Voyager Mission, it's got live tracking. They're still going. My favourite TV programme on Amazon Prime is The Farthest. If you haven't watched it, it's the best 90 minutes you're going to invest this year, honestly. So, left hand, 10 billion miles. Right hand, 14 billion miles. Stand up, 16 billion miles. Left hand, 10. Right hand, 14. Stand up, 10. Those right-handers, well done. It's 14.8 billion miles. Love that. And then the last question, because it's all linked to space. Bearing in mind that Voyager left us 45 years ago, how far does light travel in 1 year? Is it left hand 2 trillion kilometres, right hand 6 trillion kilometres, or stand up for 10 trillion kilometres? All those of you standing up, well done, thank you. 10 trillion kilometres. What's the point of this madman up on stage? This is about longevity and thinking long term and putting stuff in perspective. Very, very important to have a perspective on anything you do, specifically in the investment world. So light travels 10 trillion kilometres, or let's call it 6 trillion miles in a year, and yet Voyager that left us 45 years ago has only done almost 15 billion miles. So it's got a long way to go to get that light year, and the closest thing to Earth is at least 3 light years away. So it is a significant distance. So I did that just so you could get through this slide without feeling too bad. Let's just talk about some stuff. We're not going to talk about past performance and give you any specific investment advice in this conversation. This is just a conversation around things to think about when you're preparing for what do we do with our reserves. So I'll give you 10 seconds just to think about that. 10 seconds is a long time when you're quiet. It's not 10 seconds. Right. Let's talk about the current challenges you all think about and face. Let's think about what potential opportunities there could be. Let's invest some time together in a really important point about an investment policy. And it might be a slightly dry bit. We won't spend too long on it, but I want to just talk about that for a bit. And then a topic that's probably very clear and in everyone's agenda is investing responsibly, and how do we do that? I'm sure you have seen the news. But let's just think about some important things that have happened, and probably the most, from a financial perspective, the key thing is inflation. Just want you to have a couple of moments to get your eyes used to this slide. There's 3 lines on there. The grey one is the United Kingdom, the dark blue one is the US economy, and the light blue one is the European economy. And as you can see, things track pretty much together over the years. And here we've seen this spike. We're all familiar with it. It's driving potentially the cost of living crisis in the UK. But interestingly, and this isn't a Barclays view, this is just market expectations on where inflation will go. We don't make specific predictions on any of those key things, but we work with various economists and analysts who do. You can see that there's the expectation that by the end of next year, inflation will be back to kind of where it was 2 or 3 years ago, which was quite a manageable state. So we're in this spike scenario, and it's something that clearly we need to be aware of. Interest rates are used as one of the main vehicles to control inflation. Now, at the moment, that could give opportunity for some short-term, medium-term cash reserves. You could be looking at interest rates that perhaps we haven't seen for some time ago. That's quite nice. Absolutely right. You know, there's an opportunity here to perhaps take advantage of that. Many organisations and individuals have used the pandemic to be very conservative with a small c with their finances and build up reserves both individually and corporately. And so what's interesting is actually if you're fundraising, people aren't going, well, I haven't got the spare X that I would normally contribute. Actually, I have. And what we're finding is there's opportunity to continue to receive donations and gain fundraising without too much stress in the donor base that individuals have been working with. The other point is a huge number of individuals have taken out fixed rate mortgages over the years. So therefore, even though interest rates are on the rise, and the mortgage cost is typically the one thing that hurts us the most as it rises, the impact of that's quite muted at the moment. So even though interest rates are up, so depositors could take advantage, the mortgage market is pricing different rates and pricing higher, of course, but the impact is slightly more muted than perhaps the newspapers would have you believe. And that's probably one of the reasons why I used the city examples before, is that let's look with a reference point that is longer term rather than simply the last or the next 3 months. There needs to be a slightly longer term view in terms of our thinking for those longer term reserves. For the medium term reserves, this chart is very exciting. You know, if you've got a project that you're thinking about funding in the next 12 to 18 months and you go, what do we do with our money? Well, you're going to get a better return on it now than you would have done 3 months ago. So let's look at short, medium and long terms. The reserves that you have all stewarded really well over the last number of years, but especially through the pandemic, we would always allocate with you when working with a client to make sure it's not in one big bucket. You've specifically allocated. So if there is a plan or an objective to build, refurb, help expand, whatever part of our hospice we're working on, that allocation of capital is set. We wouldn't then go, let's put that into something that has risk attached to it. You only attach risk, and risk is your friend over the long term, not your enemy. It's your enemy over the short term, so you don't use risk as a trade for a 2 or 3 year period. You only stick with cash. Those interest rates are your medium-term reserve pot, are really exciting. Your longer-term reserve pot is where we would look at a nice diversified portfolio of assets that allow you access to capital markets to take advantage of inflationary moves, to take advantage of the belief in the economic cycle that actually things do get better and grow, and over time we'll see positive outcomes, as we always have done, through the ingenuity of growth in particularly developed countries and also the emerging market countries. So having a long-term reserves policy is really important. And I think it's worth just investing as you have done perhaps, or maybe thinking about now, just investing some time in terms of what's our plan. Now, you'll be planning constantly in terms of the short term, absolutely fine. Strategically thinking about what's going to happen in the next 12 to 18 months, but that long-term plan and that long-term reserves policy is crucial to get right, and we work with a number of our clients on that basis. Busy slides, sorry about that. We're going to share these, so I think these all go around, Rowena, don't they, afterwards? So if you want to make notes on this, don't panic, it's coming as part of the follow-up pack. But just to give you an idea in terms of when you are investing that time, what you need to think about. And these are the questions we would ask, these are the questions and topics we'd go through with you. One of the classic questions is point 4, which is how risky. So finding out how comfortable individuals and trustees are and boards are with risk is a really detailed and deep conversation. And that's something that we would invest time with you on. We're going to come on to point 5 a bit later, because that's an important, current, and has been for a long time, but it's now very much a current and important point to consider and discuss. So as you can see, just going, let's invest some money, doesn't quite cut it. We need to think about a plan and build it and execute together. There are a number of board members here today, a number of trustees here today. You all have that fiduciary responsibility. You know that, you carry it out excellently. But it's working with the board and making sure the board comes to the right conclusions on things is a very important part of the relationship that we have. And I think it's crucial that when debating how to structure that long-term pot, how to navigate current financial markets, that everyone's in concert. Sorry, I like waving my hands around, apologies. Everyone's in concert together. When making a decision, behavioural finance comes into play really well. And so human bias is a really important thing to acknowledge and then work through. So recency bias, for example, in terms of do we all do end-of-year appraisals for all of our team? It's not thinking about the last 3 months of what they've delivered for us, it's the last 12 months. Recency bias, oh, someone hasn't particularly done a great job, right, we'll mark them down for the last 3, but of course it's the whole year. What have they done over the whole year? Recency bias is a really interesting one to avoid. Loss aversion is a classic, that one feels more sad by losing 10 than they are excited by gaining 10. So we fear the loss more than we get excited by the gain, even if it was the same number. So loss aversion plays a significant part in decisions, and sometimes that holds the decision process back a little bit. And therefore, working it through, building a plan and executing on that framework is really important, because it takes away some of that potential bias that an individual may overlay on what needs to be a really sensible and balanced investment decision. And availability bias, I only discovered that a couple of months ago in terms of the stuff that comes readily to mind. So, for example, current news influences our decision on a number of things. You look at the UK political environment at the moment, and you kind of go, wow, okay, how does that work? But what about thinking back over the last 2 or 3 years in terms of, I'm sorry, I will get used to this, I'm sorry. The last 3 or 4 years in terms of considering, rather than the last 3 or 4 weeks of decisions, what's happening in the next 10 years rather than what's happening in the next 2 months. That's taking that longer term view is really, really important, because if you can, that will allow opportunity. Hence, that's why, going back to the reserves conversation, making sure you clearly define the 3 pots is absolutely crucial, because then when you've defined that long-term pot, you know you've got the ability to take a longer-term plan. By the way, I have no idea where that is, but I'd like to go there. environmental, societal and governance, or ESG, sustainability, green investing, all perhaps lenses that you currently look through, may look through, might start thinking about having to look through in terms of decisions you're making. I know you've had a session on sustainability in terms of how you, as individual hospices, might look to move forward. Paul and I were at the Barclays offices in Glasgow earlier looking at our sustainable campus. We've been here for a couple of years and it's almost a carbon zero office now in terms of its setup, and how you can bring those types of ideas to both broader organisations and individual hospices is very, very important. But in terms of investments, all of those lenses can be quite challenging. You know, the current environment, what does it all actually mean? So it's helping you on your journey to make a sensible investment decision, because personal bias can come in and you go, I don't like that company, we shouldn't be investing there. Well, that may not be the right investment outcome. So looking at ethical restrictions is important, but then environmental support is then how do we invest environmentally, societally and with governance to ensure that we get to the right outcomes. So let's talk about ethical restrictions. So the vast number of portfolios that are run by the whole investment world will probably exclude gambling, pornography, arms, tobacco. Kind of your four main ones that are automatically arbed away so that you don't have to go, I'm not sure we should be. They're taken away. But then you look at things like, and let's look at the material sector here. This is an example. There's two ends of the telescope on this one. Don't own stuff that's bad, that's producing stuff that's impacting our greenhouse gases, just don't own it. Or own it because we need to help them on the journey to get us to where we need to be. So without them, for example, how do we get the copper out of the ground to build the electric cars that we need to reduce carbon emissions from the cars that aren't electric at the moment? Well, we've got to mine it, and that needs oil and it needs other stuff. So you can either say, no, we're not in any of that, or we're in it, but we're influencing. And that's a crucial conversation to get comfortable with and be part of. So one of the things that Barclays has done over the last 24 months, I'll come back to why it's only the last 24 months, is we now vote at AGMs on stock that we own. So therefore, if the board of that corporate say we're going to do A, B and C and they don't live up to that, then we vote against them actively in the AGMs. And we've now voted at 174 AGMs in the last 24 months. Some positively, some negatively. Historically, if you own a share, it's held in a nominee company. So to get technical on you for a sec. So it's not on the balance sheet of the organisation. So for example, Barclays don't own the shares, we have them in a nominee company. So therefore it's ring-fenced away, it's client monies, nothing can impact it at all. But that nominee company is passive. So historically, everyone who's owned equities or bonds has never voted at AGMs because this is a passive pot. It's just there as a house, as a custodian. But actually we've gone, hang on a second, we've got a voice here. We can do something here. We can actually make a difference. So the impact of having that voice and making those challenges helps influence the conversation. If you, again, come on, Robin. If you own the stock, you have a voice at the table. You can influence the decision, you can influence the board. If you don't own the stock, you may feel better about yourselves, but there's no debate. And that is how you get to, and that's not a right answer or a wrong answer, that's the journey that you go on when you're making ethical decisions as a board of trustees and a board of governors of and stewards of the assets that you're looking after. So it's that intellectual conversation is really, really important. And it's not one to gloss over and it's not one to shy away from, but it's a really important one. Okay? I don't think I want to make another comment on that other than there may be, so There are a number of agencies that will give you an ESG rating on a company, which is quite useful, quite helpful, because as independent investors, you can then do your own research. So MSCI, which is one of the big index providers, produces an ESG report on most companies, and therefore you can see an ESG rating. Now, some of those ratings are on a score out of 1 to 5, are actually quite useful, because you go, hey, I'm investing in this, and then a 4.5 out of 5, great, good place to be. But what about those ones that are scoring 2 at the moment, but on a massive tangential journey to be on a 5 in 2 years' time, where you go, okay, let's support them on their journey. So using that data doesn't mean a low score is bad, but it does show you where that individual organisation, company, fund is. So if you're doing some independent research, the MSCI ESG reports are very, very helpful to support you in any decisions that you make. We love a graph and a curve in investment worlds, and this is one of the best ones I know. So rather than where to invest, it's how do we feel on the investment journey. And this has an impact for all of us. So I won't read all of them, but you could argue that in the current environment, many people are in between fear and panic at the moment. If you were then to overlay performance of investment markets on this, you'll see similarities in terms of where they are, but investment markets will move more quickly than this curve. So at the point of capitulation, typically investment markets have already started to move higher. So just at the point where you're giving up, things are moving. Or even before you started to give up, things have started to move. And it's just helping our clients on that journey with how we invest, where we invest, what we're doing. So it's an educational, conversational piece. I think the key to this for me is, if you're a long-term investor, if you're prepared to commit a pool of assets for a long term, then this curve kind of flattens. You don't get caught up in it because you go, well, we're in this for a 10-year plus investment time horizon. We're not worried because we know it's a long journey. We've allocated assets correctly. Our short and medium term reserves absolutely comfortably cover everything we need to worry about. So therefore the long-term pot is exactly that. And we then don't fall foul of this middle ground. Are you putting your hand up, Toby? No, not a question? No, sorry. I've got a great question from the CEO. Sorry, sir. So the longer term you can be, the flatter this curve becomes. So you don't have the deep depression when markets are moving, because you go, that's just the nature of them. We're in and we're prepared to ride the storm. And that's an important place to be. That long-term element, I know I've said it several times, but it's really key to investing. If you're going to commit, you've got to be long-term. If someone says to me, Robin, and let's just say this is an individual rather than a hospice, Robin, in 3 years' time, I'm going to buy a big boat with all my money and sail around the world. Should I invest? No. Just keep it in cash, buy your boat, have a fun time. Robin, I'm going to buy a big boat in 20 years' time. Great. Let's start putting some of that money to work, because you've got the ability to take that long-term view. You can ride the economic cycle, and this curve for you flattens. It doesn't get as steep in that drop. So you're not in desperation, you're not in panic or capitulation when you're investing, because you've allocated your assets correctly. One of the things that I'm really interested in is what has happened to dividend income. Because one of the reasons you invest is the capital growth. But actually, a large number of our clients go, but the income that comes off this capital pot is really, really supportive, really helpful. And some, okay, we don't need it because we've got some great income flows here, so we reinvest. But others go, actually, no, that's brilliant for supportive for various projects that we're doing. So if we just look at, and the years on the bottom there are the 2020s. So 3 back is 2020, 2019. You can see that drop-off of dividend income around the world because everything shut down, right? Absolutely accepted. But what's really interesting is 21 and what's expected in 2022, broadly the same and getting back to, income levels that we saw 16, 17, not quite 18 and 19, but certainly growing. And so that gives me real interest and confidence in where the economic cycle is moving us to. That dividend flow is really powerful, really supportive for an investment journey, and you've got this drive upwards. So if you think back, we've got pots of reserves, so people haven't pushed themselves too hard, too far. They've been prudent. We've got rising income levels, if for short-term money you're thinking of interest rates, and you've got rising income levels from your equity investment. So you've kind of got a real perfect storm that may feel really tough at the moment, but over the coming months, potentially year, things will start to settle down. You'll see an opportunity for have you allocated, or if you have already allocated, great. You can now look at how that portfolio has performed over a long period rather than looking now and going, cool, that's tough. We know it's tough, absolutely right. But by sensible allocation of assets, sensible allocation of reserves, you're going to do a great job. I'm going to give you 15 seconds to read that. Here comes the next quiz, everybody. It doesn't, that's a lie. So you'll see that on our, just standard stuff. There's nothing to be worried about on that, but I need to show it to you. We're going to have some questions if we need them, but I know this is the last session, so people might be itchy to get home. I'm not, so I don't think you're keeping me, but if you want to ask some questions, we've got online stuff, I think, or we've got hands in the room. I'll happily take anything, any debate, any conversation. Would anyone like to throw us anything, or is there anything online already? Fab, do you want to throw the question already? Shall I stay over here?
Yeah, you can.
Because I keep bashing this one, so rather than bash that one as well, I might just break this one properly.
Yeah, break that one properly. Yeah. That will work. So it's a really interesting question, and for those of us that have been around in the sector for a while, this question comes up a lot. Basically, should we be pooling our assets? Would we have greater influence, hedge ourselves against risk proportionally if we pooled our reserves? That's what you were asking, isn't it, Mark? Yeah. So should hospices come together and pool their reserves to hedge against risk, or are we better making individual hospice decisions?
That is a really good question.
I know.
I love that question. Personal view, but also professional view. So you'd always treat an individual client and their needs and wants individually. So if we looked after a family of individuals, husband, wife, and children, you'd have different needs of the family. We wouldn't go, here's one size and it fits all, right? So that'd be that's my immediate reaction. Because do you get better pricing of returns the bigger you are? Not really. If you own an investment in the FTSE 100, pricing these days, it's the same at £50,000 as it is at £50 million. So I don't think that so pricing benefits don't impact. So therefore the economies of scale don't come into play. And I think the key thing is unless 2 or 3 hospices have exactly the same board and therefore exactly the same feelings about stuff, that would be the only time you go, maybe, but still, we need to borrow that bit now. When I say borrow, take that bit out now, we need that bit then. You start to mix too many paints together. I think you keep your red, your green and your blue separate, would be my view.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So we've got some other ones. People are really thinking about this. They're going to put you on the spot. So why are the markets always ahead of us in the despondency curve? And then do they just not live there? Do they just not live in that despondency curve?
So what prices an equity is the expectation of all the future dividends that it will pay out. That's your basic pricing of an equity. So in other words, that's not looking at today and going, that's going. Okay, based on where we see the world going, the next 10 years, what income streams do we think this company is going to be receiving and therefore paying out, and we value the equity accordingly. So, for example, in the technology world, over the last 12 months, things have really been kicked around because the market goes, well, actually maybe they're not quite going to get as much income from that as they thought, and therefore we'll mark them down. So a number of economic factors come into play, and a number of economic outputs are looked at. So inflationary data is not what's inflation today, but what's the expectation of inflation in 5 years' time, and therefore interest rate expectations. So the market is already thinking 5 to 10 years ahead. So as the Fed Reserve or the Bank of England or the European Central Bank makes some decisions and makes some statements, for example, that has an immediate influence on their 5-year view, not their 5-day view. And therefore the 5-day view might be, okay, it's still quite tight here, but they're going, okay, but we're not worried about the 5-day view. We can see that coming down. This is what we expect to happen in this space, not this space, and therefore the market will start to move. So it's always ahead of the current news cycle, because it's the future news cycle they're worried about, not what's actually happened today. So it's a really important piece of long-term thinking, but future-term thinking. So expectations is the key, rather than actuals. So, for example, there's a wonderful piece of data called the non-farm payrolls data. Always interests me. So in other words, in the US, how many people, except people who work on the farm because they're more migrant workers, are being employed month on month? So non-farm payrolls comes out, and that number's an important number. But it's not now, it's okay, so therefore what does that mean for the next 2, 3, 4 years? And that's what drives then this movement. So it's not based on news today, it's based on the future expectations. Does that help?
Yeah, that's really helpful, and as someone who is completely and utterly influenced by current news, that's really helpful.
And that was the point. That was the point earlier in terms of, we are influenced by what we see. I don't ever recall seeing anything on the BBC or ITV that was really positive about stuff. When was the last time you saw, good news, markets have gone up? No one says that, but over the last month, the FTSE 100's gone up by 400 points. And we never see that. All we see is cost of living crisis, it must be bad, oh my goodness. So the recency of the news flow is impacting our thinking, but that's understandable. So what you have to do is try and just split that out when you're having a broader investment conversation and try and go, okay, but what's the future expectation of stuff?
Yeah, interesting. That leads on actually to another question that's been raised and liked by a number of people, so it seems to be a popular question.
Okay, it's a big one then.
Yeah. So you gave the example of buying a yacht in the near future or investing to purchase a yacht in the future. What do you see as the long term when thinking about the timeframes in the current climate?
So, thank you. Great question. As a minimum, any investment needs to be at least 5 years. Minimum, if not longer. So if someone says, I cannot commit for this pool of money to be invested for at least 5 years, then I wouldn't be recommending going anywhere near investment markets. Because let's look at the last 5 years. Let's say the last 3 years. We'd had this conversation in November 19. And November 22 was when you wanted your money back to do the refurb, rebuild, spend it, expend the capital. Horrible chart. Look at a 10-year view. Okay, it's annoyance, but it's an okay chart. It's not a horrible one. But that 4-year, 3-year chart, if you were going, okay, I want my money back now, please, thanks for that. So even though there will be, yeah, but look, it's going up, oh, we could make some, you rein yourself in, you stick to your knitting. That's one of my phrases. The other one is problem shared is a problem halved. Thank you for that, I love that, that's a Robinism. The other one is don't push water uphill. But stick to your knitting, and if you've got a framework of short-term, medium-term, long-term, you stick to the long-term. You don't get excited by or scared by what the long-term could do, because you've made that decision has to be long-term, and that's definitely 5 years plus. In certain instances, you could argue 10 years plus. But that's mainly because if you're an organisation that has, you know, a 40-year history behind you and you expect to be going for another 100 years, why would you have a 5-year time horizon? You'd want a 10-year time horizon because we are here for the longer term. Therefore, we need to be thinking about our long-term reserves for the longer term, rather than let's make short-term decisions that may or may not benefit. You've got to have that framework and allocation.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I still struggle with the long term. Can't see it. I think we've just got time for just one more question, and
Please,
I think it's really interesting. I think because everybody's thinking about what they're doing with their reserves, how, you know, whether they should spend, save, how they should do, what they should do. So the question is, and it's ethical, but do you think it's defendable for a hospice to establish an endowment fund to provide recurrent operating income?
Just so the question here, do I think it's ethical?
Defendable for a hospice to establish an endowment fund to provide recurrent operating income. I suspect that means instead of spending the money to deliver charitable services now. I think that's what you mean, David, isn't it? Can't see where he is. I think that's what it means.
I absolutely think it's absolutely defendable because, you know, you'll have allocated assets for that medium-term project, but there will be assets where you go, okay, if we take, and the word endowment is a specifically different one. I'm going to put it to one side, just a pool of reserves. An endowment, if someone receives an endowment, it's typically gifted and therefore has to be, the rules of it have to be followed. So if the endowment is, my mother leaves £500,000 and she says, for the benefit of, that's how it has to be run. So I'll take the word endowment out and just say long pot of reserves. Because that capital, you've got a responsibility on. I see absolutely no problem in taking full responsibility and going, well, we're not spending it now because of this project. We're going to invest it. And that income, therefore, has a longevity on it that's so much more than if we just paid out. Because if income flows do slow down on the money coming through the door, let's say they did, you've exhausted these reserves here, then you're killing out the opportunity to then spend. But if you invest, and as we looked at, it's now gone, never mind, the dividend rising curve, you know, the income that we're expecting from financial markets, not solely equities, but financial markets as a whole, is going to be on the rise. You're investing for a long-term strategy that's giving you a rising level of income. You're kind of absolutely doing the right thing. But you're not over-committing to that long-term pot. That's the crucial point. So in a conversation and debate, absolutely allocate assets correctly, making sure it's conservative in terms of how much you want to allocate to the long term, but once you do, I think you're completely within your rights and seeking professional advice and making sure the money's invested. Absolutely.
Robin, thank you very much. That has been absolutely brilliant and fascinating, and for somebody who's completely and utterly freaked out by investments and the longer term view, that has been fascinating. Thank you very much.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of our first conference in Scotland. I thank you everybody for attending. It has been an amazing 3 days. I think the welcome that we've received in Glasgow has been so warm, made such a difference. I can see the delegates throughout the 3 days have been engaging, talking new networks, reconnecting with old networks. It has been an amazing 3 days, so thank you to everybody. Delegates and team. I'd also obviously have to thank our gold sponsors because without them this really wouldn't be possible. So thank you to Dreamscape Solutions, JDDK Architects that we heard from, Legacy of Lives and Towergate. But most of all, I think thank you to you all for staying for the 3 days, for engaging, participating and sharing your knowledge with us at Hospice UK. So thank you very much.
Can I just ask everyone to thank Rowena and Candice and team? Well done.